So one is that obviously every single category, that we're talking about, whether it's communists or NAACP or the Urban League, of course there is an agenda on dismantling Jim Crow in the South and also telling the North basically that, sure, formally there isn't a two-tiered racial society, but functionally there is, and we have to get rid of that. But that ran tandem with the class agenda. There was not this split that you retroactively see read into it today. And again, I'll globalize it. I spent a lot of time reading about South Africa, and you go and you look at the ANC's Freedom Charter, and the demand for public ownership and labor rights is in the same writing on full equal rights for all citizens, as well as the capacity of each different group to exercise some degree of cultural autonomy. So that, it always comes full circle, I guess, back to that some type of public good social democratic framework and a fundamental commitment to eliminate all categories of legal and political race-based or any other based hierarchy is a synchronized effort. Because even just independently of morals, you can't have a mass-based labor movement at the end of the day if it is divided by an apartheid state. When you go into, and I want you to speak specifically about Ta-Nehisi Coates, because you go into his work on housing discrimination, and I think this is very interesting because, again, and this is what happens a lot in the book that people should know. You're not negating the, legitimate points that people make, but you're enlarging it and materializing it. And your read of his history of redlining is fascinating, partially because you say that this gets attributed, the housing moves of the 40s and 50s gets attributed to New Deal policies, but actually this is already a move that is using racial politics, among other things, to get us away from sort of common good labor policies. And that's already another fundamentally big mistake in attributing this racial policy to a New Deal failure, when in fact, this is already a maneuver against labor and the New Deal. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, no, what you have during the New Deal is a kind of two-line struggle for models of the appropriate model of government stewardship of the overall economy. And you have the more progressive sort of regulatory state model. And then you've got the compensatory state model. And the regulatory state model, which is sometimes known as structural stagnationism, something, secular stagnationists, the secular stagnationist, presumed that in order for a mature capitalist economy, government had to play a part in the proper functioning of the economy vis-a-vis the citizenry, right? Because growth had basically plateaued. The compensatory state model, by contrast, calls for essentially economic stimulus, right? So it's a less interventionist approach and is about stimulating growth. And by extension, something on the spectrum of trickle down. And what happens with housing policy is kind of twofold. First, while there's no question that FHA redlining policy is a clear expression and probably the best of expression of institutional racism, right? There's no question about that. There's no question that disadvantaged Blacks in a lot of ways that, interestingly enough, the most significant of them, Coates looks past. But there's no question about that. But first and foremost, the bad guy there certainly is in part the federal government, but it's also the real estate and banking industries, which drafted FHA mortgage policy, right? And they drafted FHA mortgage policies to reflect what they had been doing before there was anything known as the New Deal. So that's our first issue. And I say this because so many people take the New Deal and FHA mortgage policies, redlining policy, as illustrative of the problems with government intervention. What's our alternative? The private sector? The private sector drafted these, right? And the point of the New Deal was to write a listing capitalist economy And this is one of the problems, right? FHA mortgage policy is one of the problems with having an approach to governance that's about writing a system that, requires the exploitation of people, right? And racially tiered housing markets were a way to make more money, basically. So that's our first issue. The other issue, though, is that housing policy, and I think you touched upon this, in the post-war era reflected the conservative struggle within, this tension within the New Deal between the compensatory and the regulatory state model. And for all intent and purpose, the push for homeownership rather than more public housing, the push for homeownership was part and parcel of a growth agenda that's, again, about stimulating, doing what's good for business. And this is why it made sense to have business draft those housing policies. The interesting thing about Coates's discussion of the legacy of FHA mortgage policy is it's actually a more conservative take on how people like Michael Katz or Michael K. Brown or Adolph Reed or Joe Quidano had talked about the problem with FHA policy. Because for Coates, the problem with FHA policy is that it prevented Blacks from accumulating wealth and passing wealth transgenerationally. For leftists, going back to the 80s, 90s, the problem with FHA mortgage policy wasn't so much that it prevented Blacks from accumulating wealth, but that was a facet of it. The big problem was that as the function of cities changed, as factories began to leave the central cities and move to the suburbs, and then eventually the hinterlands, and often enough, in moving to the suburbs, they moved near communities that were zoned in a way that limited the supply of multifamily units, apartments. Whites had an easier time of moving to the suburbs to follow those jobs often enough because they, of course, could benefit from FHA mortgage policy. Blacks, by contrast, because FHA mortgage policy was clearly an example of institutional racism, Blacks, of course, had much greater difficulty following those jobs. And as that process of urban deindustrialization continues on in the 50s and 60s, what happens is Blacks are concentrated in cities that have lost their economic base. This gets you what some people would call concentrated poverty, and the rest is history. So it's interesting that, the current discussion of the problem with FHA mortgage policy, which was real, comes down to a vision of a kind of intra-racial wealth management project, right? That presumes that the wealth that whites have today is owed simply to, benefiting from the wealth that was passed on to them transgenerationally, looking past the reality that for the past 40 or so years, the wages and wealth of the bottom 60% or more of workers, and this is going to include white workers, has been declining. And so they're losing ground as well because the game ain't what it used to be.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.